The nature of the Force. Our starting point has been the psychological doctrine, that art thou. The question that now quite naturally presents itself is a metaphysical one. What is the that to which the thou can discover itself to be akin? To this, the fully developed perennial philosophy of the Jedi has at all times and in all places given fundamentally the same answer. The unmanifest force of all existence is a spiritual absolute, ineffable in terms of discursive thought, but, in certain circumstances, susceptible to being directly experienced and realised by a human being. This absolute is the unmanifest force of Hindu and Christian mystical understanding. The last end of humanity, the ultimate reason for human existence, is unitive knowledge of the unmanifest force, the knowledge that can come only to those who are prepared to die to self and so make room, as it were, for the force. Out of any given generation of men and women, very few will achieve the final end of human existence, but the opportunity for coming to unitive knowledge will continually be offered until all sentient beings realise who they are. The unmanifest force of all existence has a manifest aspect. To use Hindu terminology, the activity of Brahman, the unmanifest force, is Ishvara, the manifest force. And Ishvara is further manifested in the Hindu trinity of Brahma, Vishnu and Shiva, and at a more distant remove in the other deities or angels of the Indian pantheon. Analogously, for Christian mystics, the ineffable, attributeless Godhead, the unmanifest force, is manifested in a trinity of persons, the manifest force, of whom it is possible to predicate such human attributes as goodness, wisdom, mercy, and love, but in a supereminent degree. Finally, there is an incarnation of the unmanifest force in a human being who possesses the same qualities of character as the manifest force, but who exhibits them under the limitations necessarily imposed by confinement within a material body born into the world at a given moment of time. For Christians, there has been, and ex hypothesi, can be but one such divine incarnation. For Indians, there can be and have been many. In Christendom, as well as in the East, contemplatives who follow the path of devotion conceive of, and indeed directly perceive, the incarnation as a constantly renewed fact of experience. Christ is forever being begotten within the individual soul by the Father, and the play of Krishna is the pseudo-historical symbol of an everlasting truth of psychology and metaphysics, the fact that, in relation to the manifest force, the personal mind is always feminine and passive. Mahayana Buddhism teaches these same metaphysical doctrines in terms of the three bodies of Buddha: the absolute Dharmakaya, the unmanifest force, known also as the primordial Buddha, or mind, or clear light of the void; the Sambhogakaya, the manifest force, corresponding to Ishvara, or the personal god of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam; and finally, the Nirmanakaya, the fully realised Jedi, the material body in which the force is incarnated upon earth as a living, historical Buddha. Among the Sufis, al-Haq, the real, seems to be thought of as the abyss of the unmanifest force underlying the manifest force, while the prophet is taken out of history and regarded as the incarnation of the force. Some idea of the inexhaustible richness of the divine nature can be obtained by analysing, word by word, the invocation with which the Lord's Prayer begins. Our Father, who art in heaven. The manifest force is ours in the same intimate sense that our consciousness and life are ours. But as well as immanently ours, the manifest force is also transcendentally imaged as the personal Father, who loves his creatures and to whom love and allegiance are owed by them in return. Our Father who art. When we come to consider the verb in isolation, we perceive that the immanent transcendent manifest force is also the immanent transcendent unmanifest force, the essence and principle of all existence. And finally, the force is in heaven. The divine nature is other than and incommensurable with the nature of the creatures in whom the force is immanent. That is why we can attain to the unitive knowledge of the force only when we become in some measure the force itself, only when we permit the force to flow through us by letting our own creaturely desires diminish. The force may be acknowledged and contemplated in any of its aspects, but to persist in worshipping only one aspect to the exclusion of all the rest is to run into a grave spiritual peril. Thus, if we approach the force with the preconceived idea that it is exclusively the manifest, transcendental, all-powerful controller of the world, we run the risk of becoming entangled in a religion of rites, propitiatory sacrifices, sometimes of the most horrible nature, and legalistic observances. Inevitably so, for if the force is an unapproachable potentate out there, giving mysterious orders, this kind of religion is entirely appropriate to our incorrectly perceived cosmic situation. The best that can be said for ritualistic legalism is that it improves conduct. It does little, however, to alter character, and nothing of itself to modify consciousness. Things are a great deal better when the transcendent, omnipotent manifest force is regarded as also a loving Father. The sincere worship of this aspect of the force changes character as well as conduct, and does something to modify consciousness. But the complete transformation of consciousness, which is enlightenment, deliverance, salvation, comes only when the force is thought of, as the perennial philosophy of the Jedi affirms it, to be immanent as well as transcendent, unmanifest as well as manifest, and when religious practices are adapted to this conception. When the force is regarded as exclusively immanent, legalism and external practices are abandoned, and there is a concentration on the inner light of the force. The dangers now are quietism and antinomianism, spiritual lawlessness, a partial modification of consciousness that is useless or even harmful, because it is not accompanied by the transformation of character, which is the necessary prerequisite of a total, complete, and spiritually fruitful transformation of consciousness. Finally, it is possible to think of the force as exclusively unmanifest. For many people, this conception is too philosophical to provide an adequate motive for doing anything practical about their beliefs. Hence, for them, it is of no value. It would be a mistake, of course, to suppose that people who worship one aspect of the force to the exclusion of all the rest must inevitably run into the different kinds of trouble described above. If they are not too stubborn in their ready-made beliefs, if they submit with docility to what happens to them in the process of communion, the force, which is both immanent and transcendent, manifest and more than manifest, may reveal itself to them in its fullness. Nevertheless, the fact remains that it is easier for us to evolve if we are not handicapped by a set of erroneous or inadequate beliefs about the right way to get there and the nature of what we are looking for. Quote,
"What is the force? I can think of no better answer than that which is. Nothing is more appropriate to the eternity which the force is. If you call the force good or great or blessed or wise or anything else of this sort, it is included in these words. It is." Saint Bernard.
End quote. The purpose of all words is to illustrate the meaning of an object. When they are heard, they should enable the hearer to understand this meaning, and this according to the four categories of substance, of activity, of quality, and of relationship. For example, cow and horse belong to the category of substance. She cooks or she prays belong to the category of activity. White and black belong to the category of quality. Having money or possessing cows belong to the category of relationship. Now, there is no class of substance to which the force belongs, no common genus. It cannot therefore be denoted by words, which, like being, in the ordinary sense, signify a category of things. Nor can it be denoted by quality, for it is without qualities, nor yet by activity, because it is without activity, at rest, without parts or activity, according to the scriptures. Neither can the force be denoted by relationship, for it is without a second, and is not the object of anything but its own nature. Therefore, it cannot be defined by word or idea. As the scripture of Shankara says, it is the one before which words recoil. Quote,
"It was from the nameless that heaven and earth sprang. The named is but the mother that rears the 10,000 creatures, each after its kind. Truly, only they that rid themselves forever of desire can feel the force. They who have never rid themselves of desire can see its effects." Lao Tzu. One of the greatest favours bestowed on the mind transiently in this life is to enable it to see so distinctly and to feel so profoundly that it cannot comprehend the force at all. These minds are herein somewhat like the saints in heaven, where they who know it most perfectly perceive most clearly that it is infinitely incomprehensible. For those who have the less clear vision do not perceive so clearly as do these others, how greatly it transcends their vision. St. John of the Cross. "When I came out of the force into multiplicity, then all things proclaimed, there is the force. Now this cannot make me blessed, for hereby I realize myself as a creature. But in this breakthrough, I am more than all creatures. I am neither the force nor creature. I am that which I was and shall remain, now and forevermore. There I receive a thrust which carries me above all angels, and by this thrust I become so rich that the manifest force is not sufficient for me, insofar as it is only the unmanifest force in its divine works. For in thus breaking through, I perceive what the force and I are in common. There I am what I was. There I neither increase nor decrease, for there I am the immovable which moves all things. Here humanity has won again what it is eternally and ever shall be. Here the unmanifest force is received into the people." Eckhart. The force gave all things up to its manifestation. The unmanifest force is poor, naked, and empty, as though it were not. It has not, wills not, wants not, works not, gets not. It is the manifestation of the force which has the treasure and the bride in it. The unmanifest force is as void as though it were not. Eckhart.
end quote. We can understand something of what lies beyond our experience by considering analogous cases lying within our experience. Thus, the relations subsisting between the world and the manifest force, and between the manifest force and the unmanifest force itself, seem to be analogous, in some measures at least, to those that hold between the body, with its environment, and the mind, and between the mind and the spirit. In the light of what we now know about the second, and what we don't know, unfortunately very much, we may be able to form some not too hopelessly inadequate notions about the first. Mind affects its body in 4 ways. Subconsciously, through that unbelievably subtle physiological intelligence which Dreich hypostasized under the name of the entelechy. Consciously, by deliberate acts of will. Subconsciously, again, by the reaction upon the physical organism of emotional states having nothing to do with the organs or processes reacted upon. And either consciously or subconsciously in certain supernormal manifestations. Outside the body, matter can be influenced by the mind in 2 ways. First, by means of the body, and second, by a supernormal process, extensively studied under laboratory conditions and described as the PK effect. Similarly, the mind can establish relations with other minds indirectly, by willing its body to undertake symbolic activities, such as speech or writing, or supernormally, by the direct approach of mind reading, telepathy, and extrasensory perception. Let us now consider these relationships a little more closely. In some fields, the physiological intelligence works on its own initiative, as when it directs the never-ceasing processes of breathing, say, or assimilation. In others, it acts at the behest of the conscious mind, as when we will to accomplish some action, but do not and cannot will the muscular, glandular, nervous, and vascular means to the desired end. The apparently simple act of mimicry well illustrates the extraordinary nature of the feats performed by the physiological intelligence. When a parrot, making use, let us remember, of the beak, tongue, and throat of a bird, imitates the sounds produced by the lips, teeth, palate, and vocal cords of a person articulating words, what precisely happens? Responding, in some as yet entirely uncomprehended way, to the conscious mind's desire to imitate some remembered or immediately perceived event, the physiological intelligence sets in motion large numbers of muscles, coordinating their efforts with such exquisite skill that the result is a more or less perfect copy of the original. Working on its own level, the conscious mind, not merely of a parrot, but of the most highly gifted of human beings, would find itself completely baffled by a problem of comparable complexity. As an example of the third way in which our minds affect matter, we may cite the all too familiar phenomenon of nervous indigestion. In certain persons, symptoms of dyspepsia, or stomach cramps, make their appearance when the conscious mind is troubled by such negative emotions as fear, envy, anger, or hatred. These emotions are directed towards events or persons in the outer environment, but in some way or other, they adversely affect the physiological intelligence, and this derangement results, amongst other things, in nervous indigestion. From tuberculosis and gastric ulcers to heart disease and even dental caries, numerous physical ailments have been found to be closely correlated with certain undesirable states of the conscious mind. Conversely, every physician knows that a calm and cheerful patient is much more likely to recover than one who is agitated and depressed. Finally, we come to such occurrences as faith healing and levitation, occurrences supernormally strange, but nevertheless attested by masses of evidence, which is hard to discount completely. precisely how faith cures disease, whether at Lourdes or in the hypnotist's consulting room, or how St. Joseph of Cupertino was able to ignore the laws of gravitation, we do not know. But let us remember that we are no less ignorant of the way in which minds and bodies are related in the most ordinary of everyday activities. In the same way, we are unable to form any idea of the modus operandi of what Professor Rhine has called the PK effect. Nevertheless, the fact that the fall of dice can be influenced by the mental states of certain individuals seems now to have been established beyond the possibility of doubt. And if the PK effect can be demonstrated in the laboratory and measured by statistical methods, then, obviously, the intrinsic credibility of the scattered anecdotal evidence for the direct influence of the mind upon matter, not merely within the body, but outside, in the external world, is thereby notably increased. The same is true of extrasensory perception. Apparent examples of it are constantly turning up in ordinary life, but science is almost impotent to cope with the particular case, the isolated instance. Promoting their methodological ineptitude to the rank of a criterion of truth, dogmatic scientists have often branded everything beyond the pale of their limited competence as unreal and even impossible. But when tests for ESP can be repeated under standardized conditions, the subject becomes under the jurisdiction of the law of probabilities and achieves, in the teeth of what passionate opposition, a measure of scientific respectability. Such, very baldly and briefly, are the most important things we know about the mind in regard to its capacity to influence matter. From this modest knowledge about ourselves, what we are entitled to conclude in regard to the force, in our near total ignorance. First, as to creation, if a human mind can directly influence matter not merely within, but even outside its body, then a divine mind, immanent in the universe, or transcendent to it, may be presumed to be capable of imposing forms upon a pre-existing chaos of formless matter, or even, perhaps, of thinking substance as well as forms into existence. Once created, or divinely informed, the universe has to be sustained. The necessity for a continuous recreation of the world becomes manifest, according to Descartes, when we consider the nature of time, of the duration of things, for this is of such a kind that its parts are not mutually dependent and never coexistent, and, accordingly, from the fact that we are now, it does not necessarily follow that we shall be a moment afterwards, unless some cause, viz., that which first produced us, shall, as it were, continually reproduce us, that is, conserve us. Here, we seem to have something analogous, on the cosmic level, to that physiological intelligence which, in men and the lower animals, unsleepingly performs the task of seeing that bodies behave as they should. Indeed, the physiological intelligence may plausibly be regarded as a special aspect of the general recreating force of incarnation. In Chinese phraseology, it is the Tao, the force, as it manifests itself on the level of living bodies. The bodies of human beings are affected by the good or bad states of their minds. Analogously, the existence at the heart of things of a divine serenity and goodwill may be regarded as one of the reasons why the world's sickness, though chronic, has not proved fatal. And if, in the psychic universe, there should be other and more than human consciousness obsessed by thoughts of evil and egotism and rebellion, this would account, perhaps, for some of the quite extravagant and improbable wickedness of human behaviour. The acts willed by our minds are accomplished either through the instrumentality of the physiological intelligence in the body, or, very exceptionally and to a limited extent, by direct supernormal means of the PK variety. Analogously, the physical situations, willed by a divine providence, may be arranged by the perpetually creating mind that sustains the universe, in which case such providence will appear to do its work by wholly natural means. Or else, very exceptionally, the divine mind may act directly on the universe from the outside, as it were, in which case the workings of providence and the gifts of grace will appear to be miraculous. Similarly, the divine mind may choose to communicate with finite minds, either by manipulating the world of beings and things in ways which the particular mind to be reached at that moment will find meaningful, or else there may be direct communication by something resembling thought transference. In Eckhart's phrase, the manifest force, the creator and perpetual recreator of the world, becomes and disbecomes. In other words, it is, to some extent at least, in time. A temporal force might have the nature of the traditional Hebrew God of the Old Testament, or it might be a limited deity of the kind described by certain philosophical theologians of the present century. Or, alternatively, it might be an emergent God, starting unspiritually at Alpha and becoming gradually more divine as the aeons rolled on towards some hypothetical Omega. Why the movement should be towards more and better, rather than less and worse, upwards rather than downwards, or in undulations, onwards rather than round and round, one really doesn't know. There seems to be no reason why a force, which is exclusively temporal, a force which merely becomes and is ungrounded in eternity, should not be as completely at the mercy of time as is the individual mind apart from the spirit. A force which becomes is a force which also disbecomes, and it is the disbecoming which may ultimately prevail, so that the last state of emergent deity may be worse than the first. The ground in which the multifarious and time-bound psyche is rooted is a simple, timeless awareness. By making ourselves pure in heart and poor in spirit, we can discover and be identified with this awareness. In the spirit, we not only have, but are the unitive knowledge of the force. Analogously, the manifest force is grounded in the eternal now of the unmanifest force. It is in this unmanifest force that things, lives, and minds have their being. It is through the manifest force that they have their becoming, a becoming whose goal and purpose is to return to the eternity of the unmanifest force. Quote,
Meanwhile, I urge you, by the eternal and imperishable truth, and by my soul, consider, grasp the unheard of. The manifest force and the unmanifest force are as distinct as heaven and earth. Heaven stands 1,000 miles above the earth, and even so, the unmanifest force is above the manifest force. The manifest force becomes and disbecomes. Whoever understands this preaching, I wish them well, but even if nobody had been here, I must still have preached this to the pews. Eckhart.
End quote. Like St. Augustine, Eckhart was to some extent the victim of his own literary talents. Le style, c'est l'homme. The style is the man. No doubt. But the converse is also partly true. L'homme, c'est le style. The man is the style. Because we have a gift for writing in a certain way, we find ourselves, in some sort, becoming our way of writing. We mould ourselves in the likeness of our particular brand of eloquence. Eckhart was one of the inventors of German prose, and he was tempted by his newfound mastery of forceful expression to commit himself to extreme positions, to be doctrinally the image of his powerful and over-emphatic sentences. A statement like the foregoing would lead one to believe that he despised what the Vedantists call the lower knowledge of the force, not as the absolute ground of all things, but as the manifest force. In reality, he, like the Vedantists, accepts the lower knowledge as genuine knowledge and regards devotion to the manifest force as the best preparation for the unitive knowledge of the unmanifest force. Another point to remember is that the attributeless unmanifest force of Vedanta, of Mahayana Buddhism, of Christian and Sufi mysticism is the ground of all the qualities possessed by the manifest force and the incarnation. The force is not good. I am good, says Eckhart in his violent and excessive way. What he really meant was, I am just humanly good. The force is supereminently good. The unmanifest force is, and its isness, Ichtigkeit in Eckhart's German, contains goodness, love, wisdom, and all the rest in their essence and principle. In consequence, the unmanifest force is never, for the exponent of the perennial philosophy of the Jedi, the mere absolute of academic metaphysics, but something more purely perfect, more reverently to be adored than even the manifest force or its human incarnation, a force towards which it is possible to feel the most intense devotion, and in relation to which it is necessary, if one is to come to that unitive knowledge which is humanity's final end, to practice a discipline more arduous and unremitting than any imposed by ecclesiastical authority. Quote,
There is a distinction and differentiation, according to our reason, between the manifest force and the unmanifest force, between action and stillness. The fruitful nature of these two aspects forever combine in a living differentiation. But the simple being of the force, according to the nature thereof, is an eternal stillness of the force and all created things. Rosebrook.
End quote. In the reality unitively known by the Jedi, we can speak no more of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, nor of any creature, but only one being, one force, which is the very substance of the divine persons. Quote,
There were we, all one before our creation, for this is our super essence. There, the unmanifest force is in simple essence, without activity. Rosebrook. The holy light of faith is so pure that, compared with it, particular lights are but impurities. And even ideas of the saints, of the Blessed Virgin, and of the sight of Jesus Christ in his humanity are impediments in the way of the sight of the force in its purity. J. Orion.
End quote. Coming, as it does, from a devout Catholic of the Counter-Reformation, this statement may seem somewhat startling, but we must remember that Olier, who was a man of saintly life and one of the most influential religious scholars of the 17th century, is speaking here about a state of consciousness to which few people ever come. To those on the ordinary levels of being, he recommends other modes of knowledge. One of his penitents, for example, was advised to read, as a corrective to St. John of the Cross and other exponents of pure mystical theology, St. Gertrude's revelations of the incarnate and even physiological aspects of the force. In Olier's opinion, as in that of most directors of souls, whether Catholic or Indian, it was mere folly to recommend the worship of the unmanifest force to persons who are in a condition to understand only the manifest and the incarnate aspects of the Force. This is a perfectly sensible attitude, and we are justified in adopting a policy in accordance with it, provided always that we clearly remember that its adoption may be attended by certain spiritual dangers and disadvantages. The nature of these dangers and disadvantages will be illustrated and discussed in another chapter. For the present, it will suffice to quote the warning words of Philo. Anybody who thinks that the Force has any quality and is not the One injures not the Force, but themselves. Quote,
You must love the Force as not the Force, not spirit, not person, not image, but as it is, a sheer, pure, absolute One, sundered from all two-ness, and in which we must eternally sink from nothingness to nothingness. Eckhart.
End quote. What Eckhart describes as the pure One, the absolute not the Force, in which we must sink from nothingness to nothingness, is called, in Mahayana Buddhism, the clear light of the void. What follows is part of a formula addressed by a Tibetan priest to a person in the act of death. Quote,
O nobly born, the time has now come for you to seek the path. Your breathing is about to cease. In the past, your teacher has set you face to face with the clear light, and now you are about to experience it in its reality, in the intermediate state immediately following death, in which the psyche is judged, or rather judges itself, by choosing, in accord with the character formed during its life on earth, what sort of an afterlife it shall have. In this interim state, all things are like the cloudless sky, and the naked, immaculate intellect is like a translucent void without circumference or centre. At this moment, know yourself and abide in that state. I, too, at this time, am setting you face to face. The Tibetan Book of the Dead. Going back further into the past, we find in one of the earliest Upanishads the classical description of the Absolute One as a super-essential no thing. The significance of the unmanifest force is expressed by neti neti, not so, not so. For beyond this, that you say it is not so, there is nothing further. Its name, however, is the reality of reality. That is to say, the senses are real, and the force is their reality. Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad.
End quote. In other words, there is a hierarchy of the real. The manifold world of our everyday experience is real with a relative reality that is, on its own level, unquestionable. But this relative reality has its being within, and because of the absolute reality, which, on account of the incommensurable otherness of its eternal nature, we can never hope to describe, even though it is possible for us to apprehend it directly. The extract which follows next is of great historical significance, since it was mainly through the mystical theology and the divine names of the 5th century author who wrote under the name of Dionysius the Areopagite that medieval Christendom established contact with Neoplatonism, and thus, at several removes, with the metaphysical thought and discipline of India. In the 9th century, Scotus Erigena translated the 2 books into Latin, and from that time forth, their influence upon the philosophical speculations and the religious life of the West was wide, deep, and beneficent. It was to the authority of the Areopagite that the Christian exponents of the perennial philosophy of the Jedi appealed, whenever they were menaced, and they were always being menaced, by those whose primary interest was in ritual, legalism, and ecclesiastical organisation. And because Dionysius was mistakenly identified with St. Paul's first Athenian convert, His authority was regarded as all but apostolic. Therefore, according to the rules of the Catholic game, the appeal to it could not be lightly dismissed, even by those to whom the books meant less than nothing. In spite of their maddening eccentricity, the men and women who followed the Dionysian path had to be tolerated, and once left free to produce the fruits of the spirit, a number of them arrived at such a conspicuous degree of sanctity that it became impossible even for the heads of the Spanish Inquisition to condemn the tree from which such fruits had sprung. Quote,
"The simple, absolute, and immutable mysteries of divine truth are hidden in the superluminous darkness of that silence which is revealed in secret. For this darkness, though of deepest obscurity, is yet radiantly clear, and though beyond touch and sight, it more than fills our unseeing minds with splendours of transcendent beauty. We long exceedingly to dwell in this translucent darkness, and, through not seeing and not knowing, to feel the force which is beyond both vision and knowledge by the very fact of neither seeing it nor knowing it. For this is truly to see and to know, and, through the abandonment of all things, to realize the force which is beyond and above all things. For this is not unlike the art of those who carve a lifelike image from stone, removing from around it all that impedes clear vision of the latent form, revealing its hidden beauty solely by taking away. For it is, as I believe, more fitting to realize the force by taking away than by ascription. For we ascribe attributes to it when we start from the universals and come down through the intermediate to the particulars. But here we take away all things from the force, going up from particulars to universals, that we may know openly the unknowable, which is hidden in and under all things that may be known. And we behold that darkness beyond being, concealed under all natural light." Dionysius the Areopagite.
End quote. The world, as it appears to common sense, consists of an indefinite number of successive and presumably causally connected events, involving an indefinite number of separate individual things, lives, and thoughts, the whole constituting a presumably orderly cosmos. It is in order to describe, discuss, and manage this common sense universe that human languages have been developed. Whenever, for any reason, we wish to think of the world, not as it appears to common sense, but as a continuum, we find that our traditional syntax and vocabulary are quite inadequate. Mathematicians have therefore been compelled to invent radically new symbol systems for this express purpose. But the unmanifest force of all existence is not merely a continuum. It is also out of time and different, not merely in degree, but in kind, from the worlds to which traditional language and the languages of mathematics are adequate. Hence, in all expositions of the perennial philosophy of the Jedi, the frequency of paradox, of verbal extravagance, sometimes even of seeming blasphemy. Nobody has yet invented a spiritual calculus, in terms of which we may talk coherently about the force and of the world conceived as its manifestation. For the present, therefore, we must be patient with the linguistic eccentricities of those who are compelled to describe one order of experience in terms of a symbol system whose relevance is to the facts of another and quite different order. So far, then, as a fully adequate expression of the perennial philosophy of the Jedi is concerned, there exists a problem in semantics that is finally insoluble. This fact is one which must be steadily borne in mind by all who read its formulations. Only in this way shall we be able to understand even remotely what is being talked about. Consider, for example, those negative definitions of the transcendent and immanent unmanifest force. In statements such as Eckhart's, the force is equated with nothing. And in a certain sense, the equation is exact, for the force is certainly no thing. In the phrase used by Scotus Erigena, the force is not a what, it is a that. In other words, the force can be denoted as being there, but not defined as having qualities. This means that discursive knowledge about the force is not merely, like all inferential knowledge, a thing at one remove, or even at several removes, from the reality of immediate acquaintance. It is, and because of the very nature of our language and our standard patterns of thought, it must be paradoxical knowledge. Direct knowledge of the force cannot be had except by union, and union can be achieved only by the annihilation of the self-regarding ego, which is the barrier separating the thou from the that.